Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today with, can you hear that? With an interesting lens. This is the Sigma 65mm f2 DGDN contemporary I-series lens here for Sony E-mount. If you've watched any I-series lens reviews from other folks, myself, etc., you'll know that these lenses are built around an experience more than they are hyper optical quality. So this particular lens is metal. It's solid. We've got a lot of manual, satisfying mechanical. Oh, that's so good. Aperture ring here, which you can, if you hate mechanical aperture rings, you can put it in the A mode and then control it from your camera. We've got a manual focus autofocus switch there, which of course we need for astrophotography. And we've got a fairly smooth manual focus ring. It's metal, knurled. It's good to hold on to. It's good. I like it. Of course, that's it, because these lenses are not meant to have something like Sigma's newest 20mm or 14mm lenses where they have declickable apertures and manual focus lock switches and aperture ring lock switches and all that kind of stuff. They're meant around an experience and strongly leaning towards manual experience. In fact, that's why I picked this one up, so I could use it with this, the Nikon ZF. Very, I just love it so much. Very vintage-esque digital camera and a very vintage-esque lens. And you might think, okay, you're holding a Sony lens and you're holding a Nikon Z camera. No work, right? Well, there are actually adapters for Sony lenses that will let them work on Nikon Z mount cameras. In this case, the one I use is the Megadap ETZ21. And in my experience, it works flawlessly. Tracking autofocus, all that stuff. You wouldn't even know that you're not using a native lens. And I enjoy the heck out of using this particular one. We do have a full metal hood here, and you'll notice it's not a pedal type, it's just a cylindrical hood. It is kind of nicely knurled. One thing I've found, it's breaking my heart, I got a scrape on here. Being anodized aluminum, it is subject to getting knocked and scraped and scratched and stuff, and that will take the anodization off. But you know what, that's just aesthetics. Which, I mean, let's be honest, this guy doesn't give no shoots about aesthetics. Take off the 62mm lens cap here, 62mm diameter, to reveal a not 62mm diameter front element, but you can, of course, use 62mm threaded filters on here if you need to for whatever reason. In this case, these lenses also come with a little magnetic lens cap, but as you might hear through any review of these lenses, when the hood's on, it can be really hard to take it off. So I stick to the pinch cap. That being said, this lens, I do enjoy it a lot in the context of why I bought it, for running around in black and white mode on the ZF and just being pretentious as all hell. But is it good for astrophotography? You know, 65mm, it's a little too zoomed in to really do untracked, but for tracked astrophotography, f2, it's not that fast. You know, you might not have too many optical compromises as far as the lens formula goes, so it'll be interesting to see. I haven't seen yet, so let's go find out together. Howdy folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here we have a collection of samples taken with the Sigma 65mm f2 DGDN contemporary lens, launched in 2020, part of Sigma's I-series. Now, this is a very aesthetically pleasing lens, and I like it a lot. And I have actually used it for some astrophotography, as you can see there on the bottom, back when the Pons-Brooks comet came through earlier this year, 2024 in March. And I do have some other samples here as well, so we're going to look at all that. First of all, you can see that these samples are all quite dark. That is in no small part because this is an f2 lens. I have two sets of samples. I have one set of samples here on a tripod with the Sony Alpha 1, and luckily this is one of the times that I remembered to keep my camera out of Super 35 mode. So we actually have the full 50 megapixel files. I have another set taken with the Sony a7R Mark V. These are the torch test 60 megapixel sensor, 60-second exposure tracked with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II. All of these samples are taken at the camera's respective second base ISO. And we got a lot to address here. So the two cameras that I'm using here have dual gain sensors, which is to say that they only have two quote unquote real ISO values, two analog ISO values, and they're ISO invariant because of this. So every ISO in the A7R Mark V, for instance, above 320, you can think of it like being fake. It's just digitally amplified. It's the same thing as if we came here and we just boosted the exposure. Mind you, is something we will do here. We'll just boost the exposure twice in all of these frames. Perfect, now we can see something. But that's all the camera is basically doing. Problem is, it's locking the file in at that exposure. So if you lose any highlights, let's say you can see down here, we've got the Andromeda Galaxy. If you blow out that central core, there's no recovering it. If you want to keep the noise at a decent level and the shadows, you want nice recoverable shadows, you get the exact same performance at ISO 320. The exact same performance, same noise, same shadows. The only thing is you might retain some of that highlight data that might have been clipped. So there is a bit of an incentive to do so. That's why I shoot at ISO 320. If you want to learn more about that, there's a link in the description. It'll take you back to Fervent Astronomy's website where there's an article link there. It will bring you through all of the ISO invariance goodness written by very smart people at, I believe, Photography Life. Really happy to have found that article. Also, ferventastronomy.com, you'll find some information about the LighTrack II, portable star tracker by Fornax Mounts, which is the tracker used to track these photos. It is, of course, quite good from my biased opinion because Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's North American distributor. So at that link, you can find some information about that. In addition to these samples, which will be available in all of their raw glory for you to download, for you to pixel peep with, for you to really get an amazingly detailed, nerdy look at the extreme corners at 1600% zoom, a completely normal thing to do. He jokes right before we do that. So yeah, these samples are available for your personal perusal to help you assess the lens's performance, but please respect my copyright, respect that these are my works, good or bad, artistic or not. Please don't use them in any other fashion. Please don't redistribute them online or otherwise. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't use them as the basis for your own review. Please use them in good faith for the purpose of assessing the lens's performance, which is the purpose for which I'm providing them. That's a lot of P words. All right, so now that we've got all that preamble, there's another P word out of the way. Let's take a look at the untracked samples. We're really just going to focus on the sample taken at f2 here because that's the only one you'd want to. This is 50 megapixels, Sony Alpha 1, f2, 15-second exposure. And at a normal viewing distance, I can just barely start to see some trailing here at 15 seconds. Keep in mind here, we had to boost the exposure a couple of times out of the camera. This is quite dark, and that's even at ISO 500 with the Alpha 1. We zoom into the middle. Here, it's pretty apparent that we've got some fairly aggressive star trails, which is what you would expect at 65 millimeters. Around the frame, they're going to be pretty consistent. They will change direction. I don't know if you have seen this before. They will change direction depending on what part of the frame they're in, as both a function of the geometry of the sky where you have the camera pointed, but also the geometry of how the lens focuses. So you might notice here that these are almost perfectly diagonal, and up in the right-hand corner, they're getting more lateral, but they are trailing because things are spinning, right? Kind of annoying for astrophotography, but I'm told it's good for other reasons like having day and night, which I guess is fine. I guess I'll put up with it. Let's now zoom into the tracked sample here. Right away, if we look up here in the navigator, we see that there is some vignetting happening in the corners, which is what you would expect. And if we stop down to 2.2, you can see that the bright spot in the center of the frame disappears, although it extends almost all the way to the vignetting here. So while we might get a little bit better contrast here at f2.2, I don't think that's a reason to stop down. I think you're giving up some exposure here. You can see the histogram is tightening up quite a bit to the left. So I would stick at f2 here, if at all. If we zoom into the center here, first things first, I don't see a ton of chromatic aberration. I don't see a ton of fringing. I don't think that that's going to be a terrible problem with this lens, although we can look more in the corners in a moment. As far as any spherical distortion goes, I don't see that the stars are bloating out and getting low contrast around them, so I don't think that that's really that big of an issue either. Zoom in the corner. Right away we see not only actually a little bit of chromatic aberration now, here's that purple fringe and a little bit warm side on this side, but we see some astigmatism. Yes, dear viewer, this is not coma, this is astigmatism. We'll talk about it. So there are two types of astigmatism. There, you can imagine, are infinite radii coming from the center of the frame to the edges. And everywhere that there's a star, you'll find that along that line, the star may stretch out. And this is tangential astigmatism. This will be following that line from the edge to the center of the frame. And you'll find that you might get these shapes that look like little birds or little airplanes. What's happening is the lens is not able to focus the light to a pinpoint, and it's getting stretched out along that line. The wings of these little birds is something called sagittal astigmatism. It's the same phenomenon. Essentially, the lens is not able to focus that light at the point, so it's getting stretched out at essentially what's a right angle to the tangential astigmatism. Sometimes it curves a little bit, sometimes it'll shoot out in interesting ways, but in all cases, it will never point directly towards the center, or I suppose to the edge along that same radius. It'll always appear out the sides a little bit. It gives the effect, no matter where you look in the frame, that you'll have possibly an elongation towards the center of the frame, which is the tangential, but you might have an elongation laterally, which is sagittal, and it kind of will give it a sense that it's ringing the frame. Now, we just saw here, I don't know if you picked it up, but when we looked here, the shapes are a little bit different, so there's not amazing symmetry here. It does kind of still look bird-shaped, but not quite to the same extent. So if you look in all the corners, you'll see how things change, and the more they are the same, the more symmetrical the lens is. And the more they appear to change, there's a little bit of extra funny business going on there. Maybe there might be some decentering or some lens tilt inside the lens somewhere. And here you might get some really wonky ones. But overall, when this becomes a problem is, for me, when it makes the stars on the edges look bigger than they should be, when it makes it look like it's warping through space, that is when I start to question whether I should use a lens, because that's what gives your photos a weird effect, which can be used artistically, but sometimes it just kind of looks bad. So that's not up for me to tell you what works for you, but that's my personal calculus. If you look here, we see this lens is split. We've got two fuzzy bits and then some wedges in here that are dark. Still have to find an educated source to explain exactly what this is, but I've seen it on several lenses. It's quite common, actually. But overall, this is fairly easy to correct as well. You can make this look round again fairly easily. Luckily, there's only one, maybe two stars here that are exhibiting that. Yeah, so that's fairly easy. Well, maybe a little bit here to fix in post. Now, I said that this is astigmatism and not coma. What's coma? Well, coma seems to be lacking in this lens, as it does in many lenses these days. Coma is when you'll get stars and they will develop a fuzzy tail. They'll make possibly a bit of a wedge shape, possibly a little bit of a Pac-Man ghost shape, and one side will be fuzzy, and that will either all point towards the center of the frame or all point towards the edges of the frame. Internal coma points towards the middle, external coma points towards the edges, along the same radii that the tangential astigmatism falls along. And in this particular case, while I do see the distortions, the stretching of the stars from the astigmatism, I'm not seeing a bunch of fuzzy comet tails. So I do not believe that coma is very relevant to this lens. If we look in the edges here as well, we're going to try and assess for field curvature. So we are losing the shapes of the stars to the astigmatism. But if we snap to the center, we can kind of compare the sizes of the stars. And it looks like maybe there's a bit of field curvature, which is to say that when the stars are focused in the center, they're maybe not focused along the edges or the corners, and vice versa. Sometimes it can be extreme. In this case, if it is happening, it's so limited that it's sort of irrelevant, because the thing that's really overwhelming it is the astigmatism. So I don't really think that's a problem. Let's flip through the apertures again. F2, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. I'd say from zoomed out performance, F2 is probably where it's at. In the center, F2, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. It's not enough being corrected there in the center for me to want to stop down. Let's go to the edges. Here we are at F2, 2.2. We're not really fixing any of that astigmatism. 2.5, like barely, like maybe these are tightening up a little bit. 2.8, tangential is still there. Often what will happen is the sagittal will correct itself a little bit, the tangential not so much. That is what we're seeing here, but I don't think it's worth stopping down to 2.8 based solely on that, because you can't really notice when zoomed out, which is how people look at photos. Now that we've got that done, let's pop into the develop module, and we're going to take a little look at some of this stuff. Here, first, let's see if the chromatic aberration can be fixed. A little bit. You see it's trying to counteract it. sort of flipping the colors. It's making the backside look warm and the front side look a little bit cooler as far as temperature goes. And we can see there is that still some purple here. The fringe is a little more aggressive. Just used the defringe dropper and that basically got rid of it. So not a problem there. Profile corrections. Okay, so first things first, it does a fairly decent job getting rid of the vignetting. Still in the corners, we've got a little bit of it, but overall, it's doing a good job. Now this lens appears to exhibit pincushion distortion, which is to say that the frame through the center is kind of like pushed away from the viewer. So when you correct it here, what's happening in the geometry is changed to bring the center forward a little bit, and it tapers off towards the corners. So you actually don't lose any field of view corner to corner. If you watch, the stars really don't move much, but you are losing some at the top and bottom, and I think the right and left, you're losing a little bit of that edge, which isn't probably going to be where your subject is, so it's probably not going to be that important. We scale down a little bit, we can see how that transformation happened. It's literally stretching the image vertically and horizontally to get that effect. And yeah, overall, I would say it's probably safe to do that. And what you're left with is not a half bad frame. Let's go look at this particular sample. So mind the satellite trails. There's nothing you can do about it these days. But of course, we've got Comet here, Andromeda. We've got some ramshackle shack from my family's farm. And we've got our galaxies. And in this case, you know, this was back in March. There's a bit of haze in the sky, so the contrast isn't that great. You can see a bit of the spatial filtering that is built into Sony's cameras where it acts to reduce noise. And what you're left with sometimes, especially when you've got a lot of stars that are on the verge of being bright, but not quite that bright, is they end up getting quote unquote eaten by Star Eater. And in the case of most modern Sonys, what that typically manifests as is wonky shapes. And here the shapes are indeed a little bit wonky. And you know what? At 400% and at normal viewing distances, it's two different stories. So if you want to take a picture of Andromeda, don't do it with a 65mm lens. If you want to get a wide field of Andromeda and a comet and all kinds of other business, yeah, go ahead and don't worry about those little minutiae. But if we come up here towards the top here, you can see that astigmatism coming into play a little bit. And this is a 30-second exposure. So this isn't even the 60-second. 30-second exposure. Obviously there is a lot of light pollution and haze here, even though I was a bit out in the country. Sometimes you just can't get rid of that no matter where you go these days. Overall, I think the aberrations here don't detract from the image. I think the satellites are probably the worst. Here we got a bright star doing a little astigmatic thing here, but from a normal viewing distance, it's kind of not that big of a deal. Here, some of these stars are showing up a little brighter, and if we come in here and we defringe them, I suppose that will fix things up a little bit, make them a little less noticeable, get some profile correction business happening, get rid of some of that. I almost preferred some of the vignetting, to be honest. And then you can go about things, and if you're been a little bit better with your color balance and stuff, you won't have to do what I do, which is to try and fix some of this. And anyway, we won't bore you with that, but this is the type of thing that you can use this lens for, and I would say does not too bad of a job here. So overall, I used it. I'm happy with what I got. One day I might even process these because they've been sitting for months, but I guess I'm choosing to spend my time making this YouTube review instead of actually processing my images. Maybe that's a conversation I have to have with myself. Anyway, let's get out of Lightroom and wrap this up. Ta-da! The Sigma 65mm f2 DG DN contemporary I-series lens. Is this the lens for you? It's probably not going to be the #1 astrophotography lens of the century. Tracked astrophotography at 65mm, that is interesting. I do enjoy where we're going there, especially if you have a really dark sky. If you're doing some Milky Way stuff, you can get in really close to a lot of that detail there and make the Milky Way seem big. Other things I think it might be useful for, you can get big constellations like Orion. Maybe if you're lucky enough to have a modified camera, you can get the constellation of Orion with Barnard's Loop and all the various nebulae in there. That'd be pretty cool. Actually, that's something I might try myself if I get a chance this winter. All in all, this lens is not making any promises that it can't cache. I'm not expecting this to be my primary astrophotography lens, but you know, it's not necessarily one that I won't use. How about you? Is this a lens for you? I can't tell you. It's not my job to tell you what to do. I'm just here to provide you the tools to make the assessment. So I hope you've enjoyed that. If you end up getting one of these lenses, I hope you enjoy it. I'm Darren, Fervent Astronomy. Take care.